Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer, and for today's video we have something different entirely. We're going to take a look at 3 weapons that were really popular at launch, and we're going to answer several questions about these weapons, whether or not they're still good, and that is going to be the Rivers of Blood, Moonveil, and the Sword of Night and Flame. One of the most common comments I get on my older videos and newer videos is whether or not these 3 weapons, which were incredible weapons, all 10 out of 10 at launch, are still viable and still good to build around now heading into DLC. We're going to start here with Moonveil, and then we're going to go over the Rivers of Blood and then the Sword of Night and Flame. We're going to analyze each one. We're going to take on mini-bosses, mobs, etc., go over the details on them, and then at the end we're going to give a rating to each one as well, and whether or not I think they're viable now. Now, starting with Moonveil, Moonveil was an incredibly popular weapon at launch, not just for PvE, but also for PvP. It, generally speaking, was incredibly powerful because of the poise damage it does and the amount of magic damage you can get from the beam on its Ash of War. People loved it at launch. It was one of the most popular weapons, and I don't just mean popular, I mean literally like half of the people that were playing PvP and a ton of the people that were playing PvE were wielding Moonveil. It was one of those things where it was kind of like a phenomenon in Elden Ring where people just could not put down this weapon. Now, I'm going to be one of those players that was using Rivers of Blood a lot at launch, and I know that's probably going to bother some people, but we will go over that weapon as well as the Sword of Night and Flame. But you can see here, right now, it still does a ton of poise damage, a fairly good amount of magic damage, and overall, it is still very reliable. Something to note about Moonveil is it's incredible against NPC invaders. It's very good against mobs too, especially with its poise breaking ability, and then of course it still has uses in PvP, although keep in mind people do know how to dodge Moonveil and Rivers of Blood way more than they did at launch. We're going to end up taking on a mini-boss. By the way, all footage here is on New Game Plus 7, as always, at rune level 150, and we're going to take this crazy rune bear on in Consecrated Snowfield. He has around 30,000 HP, and see how Moonveil holds up. One of the best way to fight the rune bears, by the way, is by going under them. A lot of their attacks will miss under them. They have a couple of slams, and the scream or roar, or whatever you want to call it, that they do can actually hit you from behind, which is a little bit frustrating. But overall, if you stay underneath them, it's an effective way to take them on. And we do take a little bit of a beating here. I think I get hit a couple of times, but overall you can see the damage on Moonveil on New Game Plus 7 does have a little bit of a fall off from New Game. Now, some weapons hold up on New Game Plus 7 or New Game Plus and beyond rather very well. Moonveil, unfortunately, is not one of them. It tends to have a big drop off. Now, at launch, I believe this was a little bit overhyped. I gave it a 9 out of 10, and now I would say it's an 8 out of 10 because people became more aware overall that New Game Plus and later, it just doesn't hold up as well, but it's still overall a solid and powerful weapon. And first things first, we're going to drink our tier, which has the Magic and Faith tier in it. Then we're going to cast Golden Vow, which will give us 15% more attack and defense. Then Flame Grant Me Strength, 20% physical damage, which will increase our physical damage for 30 seconds. Then cast Terra Magica, which is 35% more for the beam. And then, of course, we have Transient Moonlight, which is really cool. You could use the charge attack for a lot of posture damage and big damage in general, and then the light attack. And then we have our regular light attacks and charge attacks, although the Ash of War is the best part. Let's jump into equipment. And we have Moonveil plus 10. We have the Astrologer's Staff. We're just using it for Terra Magic, though. Any seal for buffs. The Spellblade set will boost the beam part of this. We have the Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm, Listens Prosthesis for some added dexterity, Magic tier, Faith tier so we can use our buffs. Let's jump into stats for this build. And for stats on this one, I elected to go for 50 Vigor so we can have better split stats here. So we have 50 Dexterity and 50 Intelligence, 25 Faith with the Faith tier so we can use our buffs, 21 Mind and 21 Endurance. And for our buffs, we're using Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and Terra Magica. As for Moonveil as a whole, I gave it an 8 out of 10, and I do believe it's still viable going into DLC, but it does have a drop-off after New Game Plus. Now, where do you get Moonveil at? A lot of people are going to ask where do you get Moonveil at if they don't know. If you do know, you can skip to the next thing. Everything's timestamped, by the way, as always. You get this near Fort Gale or Fort Goal, however you say it, in Caelid, and then you can follow me on screen. We're going to end up entering a cave in which Moonveil is a drop from the boss. The fort I came from, by the way, is to the right of Rotview Balcony. You cannot miss it whatsoever. It's very easily visible. Grab the Site of Grace there. You can go down from Rotview Balcony too, but it was just easier to show it this way, and then you're going to enter Gale Tunnel. For those that are just watching this video, hanging out, and kind of already know where to get Moonveil, I want to ask you a quick question. How do you feel about these weapons at launch? If you're around at launch, how do you feel about them then, and how do you feel about them in their current state now on patch 1.10? You can go into numbers, you can talk about your build, all that. I'm curious as to what your opinions are on Moonveil, the Sword of Night and Flame, and the Rivers of Blood post-launch to where we are now, and whether or not you think they're going to be viable heading into DLC. And of course, at the end of this video, if you want to comment if any of this stuff in this video changed your mind. Now, one of the many great things about Elden Ring is that you can run past the majority of enemies if you feel like it, or if you can fight them if you want. If you don't feel like fighting them, though, or if you're trying to get this relatively early, which you can, you could just go right here to this boss room, and the boss room right here is going to be the Magma Worm, and he will drop Moonveil. So it's not too bad to get to. I'll show the map one more time, and then once you grab this Site of Grace here, this second Site of Grace, it's actually not mandatory to defeat the boss. It'll open up the tunnel and you'll be able to fast travel, leave however you want whatsoever. You won't be trapped there anymore. There it is on the map there in Caelid. And next up here, we're going to be talking about the Rivers of Blood. Now, the Rivers of Blood at launch was a phenomenal weapon. It was ridiculous. The Ash of War could proc bleed literally 2 or 3 times on the Ash. It was so absurd. It was probably the most powerful weapon in the game, and honestly, it was flat out broken. Now, interestingly enough, before they split the patches, if you're new to Elden Ring, you probably wouldn't know this, but if you've been around since launch like myself, you know that originally when they did patches, it was across the board. It was for everything. Now, PvP and PvE are split. Well, why am I bringing this up? It's because it was so ridiculously overpowered in PvP that a lot of players were complaining about the Rivers of Blood, and they did a nerf for it that also affected PvE, and the first nerf on the Rivers of Blood hit very hard. So what the nerf ended up doing was Corpse Piler, the Ash of War, it took the Ash of War and decided that it was going to proc bleed at a much lesser rate. The bleed procs on the Ash were nerfed substantially along with the damage as a whole. So no, this weapon is not what it was at launch. It was actually nerfed even more after that. Between the PvE and PvP splits, there were even more nerfs that came along. They did do a minor buff, I believe, to the damage again, just to buff it a little bit on the Ash of War, but it didn't make up for how much power it lost. That being said, it's still an amazing Ash of War for NPC invaders. It's still something that people do use in PvP because of the fact that it has decent range. The range also was nerfed. That was nerfed too. Pretty much everything related to Corpse Piler you can consider at this point nerfed. Now we're going to move on to a boss and the build. By the way, I decided for all tough like side bosses and stuff in this video to leave out spoilers for anybody that's new that's looking into these weapons. I kind of have been doing that with my Wednesday videos. If you notice, it's mostly been side bosses and kind of non-spoiler content. Alright, so if we're at launch, even on New Game Plus 7, probably 1 Ash of War on that boss, in all honesty, would have gotten you 2 bleed procs, a ton of damage, and it ended up taking way more than that. This weapon is now a 5 out of 10, and honestly, I don't like it that much. It's just not what it used to be, and it kind of sucks. But here's the build. We have the Rivers of Blood plus 10, the Dragon Communion Seal, White Mask, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, or you could use Ritual Sword Talisman here if you don't have both that and Listens Prosthesis, Shard of Alexander, Lord of Blood's Exaltation. Then we have Melissen's Prosthesis for the added dexterity and the successive attack damage, the Thorny Tear, the Faith Tear. Let's jump into stats for the Rivers of Blood build. I hope I didn't offend anybody by saying that it sucks in all seriousness, but at the same time, I just do think it sucks now. A keen Nagakiba with Bloodflame Blade will beat it. I have testing for that versus the Rivers of Blood. I'll leave that in the description below on my alt. We have 45 Dexterity, 45 Arcane, 60 Vigor, Golden Vow, and Flame Grant Me Strength. Yeah, it's definitely not what it used to be, no question about it. I think a 5 out of 10 is pretty fair. Maybe a 6 out of 10 at best, but I think my 5 out of 10 is going to be pretty solid there. We're drinking our tear first, then we're casting Golden Vow, then Flame Grant Me Strength after we fill up our FP, give us a little bit of an added buff, then we use Corpse Piler. Another thing to mention is that the Rivers of Blood's Ash of War Corpse Piler even feels weak before you hit anything now. That's weird to say. I don't even know how to explain that in like words, but when you look at it and you have a feel for it, it just feels weak now before you even hit an enemy with it. Now I'll show on the map at the end here where to get it, but this is where you get the Rivers of Blood. You do have to take on an NPC invader, and the Rivers of Blood does shine against NPC invaders, and again, still has a niche use in PvP, but overall, as far as bosses and stuff goes, this weapon is just not what it used to be. And I know I probably said that a few times, but one of the most common comments on my channel is, can I still use the Rivers of Blood? Is it still something that I could use as they're coming back for DLC? And honestly, I really can't recommend this weapon. Pick yourself up a keen Nagakiba or starting Katana and throw Bloodflame Blade on it. Yeah, with Double Slash, you won't regret it. You'll have a better split, too, with more physical damage, around the same bleed, and it works New Game Plus and beyond. It'll hold up, too. I really like that setup much better than the Rivers of Blood. If you do want to pick up the Rivers of Blood, it's at Mountaintops of the Giants, right there at that church. And now on to probably my favorite one on this list, because I think this weapon's a lot of fun, too, and that is the Sword of Night and Flame. Yeah, this weapon's really enjoyable to use too. Now you have two options. You can use the beam, which is the comet, which is relatively short range but very high damage and it's pure magic damage, or you have the fire option, which is faith based, has a good sweep, and is better for mobs. Yeah, this weapon is still quite good. I elected to build around the beam rather than the faith part because I capped my rune level at 150 for all of these builds, but you can build around both to get good damage out of each one. The sweep, though, the fire part, definitely better for mobs. The beam part can absolutely destroy some bosses still. The Sword of Night and Flame at launch could one-shot a lot of the bosses with the beam because it was so absurd. I believe it even had better range. I didn't use it as much as the Rivers of Blood and Moonveil around launch. Rivers of Blood I think was the one I used the most, but overall it did a lot more damage. But that being said, it's still very good even with, I believe, less range. The beam itself, very powerful. Now I'm going to show off the fire sweep on mobs here, and you're going to see how it can destroy them very easily because it has a really wide sweep and it's very powerful. Even with around 35 faith with the faith tier, it does really well on mobs, but there is something about the Sword of Night and Flame I do want to talk about real quick. So, the Sword of Night and Flame and the Rivers of Blood had something in common. They both saw massive nerfs, and then they were slightly brought back. The Rivers of Blood was buffed a little bit on the Ash of War, but not nearly enough and stayed relatively bad. However, the rebuff that was done for the Sword of Night and Flame to kind of bring it back a little bit actually worked. Now, most of this stuff happened around 1.06 and 1.07, and the Sword Night and Flame was rebuffed a little bit because they realized they over-nerfed both weapons. However, as mentioned, it didn't really help the Rivers of Blood that much, but the Sword of Night and Flame was able to get its damage back quite well, and overall is still a solid weapon. I'm going to show a tougher enemy real quick, and then we're going to take on a relatively tough boss with decent resistances, the Magma Worm in Consecrated Snowfield. I believe he has around 30,000 HP, so that should be a tough task for us. Overall, though, we're going to see here with the Octopi in Consecrated Snowfield, it also works well on them and can take on tougher enemies, as the beam can do massive damage. Could actually work if you want to farm these guys, if you end up needing the Land Octopus Ovary or whatever it is, so that you can make Blood Boil Aromatic, if I'm saying that correctly now. We're going to see on this boss, who has around 40% magic resistance and a decent amount of HP, how well the Sword of Night and Flame holds up. And in the first two beams we end up using here, we get a good chunk of damage off the Magma Worm. Again, he's pretty resistant overall, has a high health pool on New Game Plus 7, and he's relatively challenging, and we're still getting good damage out of the Sword of Night and Flame. Now, normally the land octopi in the area can help with this fight. There's one or two of them that you can use, and they can even poise break him, and they can turn this fight into a complete joke. But we wanted to highlight the Sword of Night and Flame, and overall with the beam, I'm quite impressed. This is a weapon I can honestly recommend taking into DLC. You're going to get magic damage, you can get fire damage, and yes, splitting your stats isn't really the most recommended things for a lot of builds, but in this case you can build around one or the other. If you like one better than the other, go for the minimum stats on the opposite one. In this case, I built around the beam, and the damage is great. Yeah, I absolutely love the Sword of Night and Flame. I'm liking it more and more, and honestly, it's going to be one of those weapons where I use it more because it's just a really enjoyable weapon. We even got a posture break there. I didn't even realize that the Sword of Night and Flame did that much poise damage. He has decent poise on New Game Plus 7, probably around 150, and we're even able to get a posture break. And for this one, I'm going to give this one the highest rating. At launch, it was a 10 out of 10. Now it's an 8.5 out of 10. This is a completely viable and good weapon. It works on New Game Plus and beyond base game. Overall, it's a solid weapon and a solid choice, and a weapon you can definitely take into DLC. Alright, we're going to go over the build for this. First things first, we're going to drink our tier, which has the magic tier in it, because we're building around the beam part. Then we're going to use Golden Vow, and since we have enough faith, we're going to fill up our FP. Use Hellish Brewery for another 25% generic damage. After that, we can cast Terra Magica 2 if you end up standing in. That's another 35% damage on the magic part of it. And then we have the beam, the comet. We have the fire sweep, which is really effective against mobs. And then, of course, your regular moveset, not too impressive, regular kind of straight sword moveset. You're not going to be using charged or regular attacks too much with the Sword of Night and Flame. In a second here, we're going to go over build stats and everything you need to know. We have the Sword of Night and Flame plus 10. The Golden Order Seal is good with our stats. You could use the Prince of Death Staff, I guess, too. That would be decent scaling-wise. The Spellblade stat will boost the beam. We have the Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm, Ritual Shield Talisman. Then we have the magic tier because we're building around the beam part. Faith tier. Let's talk about stats for this build. And for stats, since as mentioned I went for the beam because it's the higher damage part of the Ash of War, I went for 60 intelligence, 35 faith with the faith tier, we have 60 vigor, 23 mind, 22 endurance, and then pretty much the minimum dexterity, 16 strength from the hero starting class. And we're going to be using Golden Vow, Hellish Abriri, and Terra Magica to boost the damage on the Ash of War. And for me personally, I would definitely build around the beam. It's more reliable, but if you're really high level, you can use the fire too. Again, mob control, it's excellent at. Where do I get the Sword of Night and Flame? And you get it at Carrion Manor in the Liurny of the Lakes, and you're going to go to the lower level Site of Grace. Follow me on screen here. It's a little bit out of the way to grab this weapon if you don't know where it's at, but I recommend picking it up. It's a lot of fun, and it's a very good weapon. Also, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was one of those videos that I made simply because of the number of comments. The number of comments when people came back asking specifically about these 3 weapons, it was kind of overwhelming to get back to all of them, so I figured I'd make a video with all the info in it. I was originally going to put this on my alternate channel. By the way, the Rivers of Blood vs Keen Nagakiba, I'm going to leave that in the description below. I have an early game Venomous Fang build. If you haven't checked that one out either, I'll also put that in the description below. And if you're not subbed to my alternate channel, but you really like my main channel, be sure to sub to that channel too. Also add my big DLC prep video if you haven't seen that one yet. There's a lot of good feedback on that one. That shows you how to get everything for some of the best builds that you can bring into DLC. Thanks for watching this one. I really appreciate everybody that watched this video. Definitely be sure to sub if you're not subbed yet. Another thing to mention is this video was set up as a fundraiser. I've been doing that on my Wednesday videos. I'm a big animal person. It's one of the largest no-kill animal shelters. If you get a chance to donate, it's very much appreciated. So, Moonveil and Sword of Night and Flame, for me, DLC approved. As somebody with 2,000 hours into Elden Ring, the Rivers of Blood, in my opinion, I'm going to give a no to. I don't think it's that great. Thanks for watching.